All right, everybody, here we are, San Antonio Bitcoin meetup. Let's get a whoop or something. Any acting crowd? No. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. For anyone who doesn't know me, is new to the meetup, I'm Weston. I'm a partner at Deflation Capital with Lou Mormon, who's out there in the crowd. We got with Lou. This is G. Introduce yourself here.
How's it going, guys? I'm
He's
G.
the founder of the club.
I don't know if this is okay. There we go. Yeah. So I'm the organizer of the meetup tonight. Thank y'all for coming out. I just wanted to say a few words. I appreciate everyone for taking the time to come out. You're all here because y'all chose to be here, and that's the thing about Bitcoin. It draws in quality. The definition of quality is superior in kind. And I believe everybody in this room is of quality. They say iron sharpens iron, and that's the golden eye, that everyone leaves a bit sharper than when they came in. Here, we at San Antonio Bitcoin Club believe if we can get San Antonio on a Bitcoin standard, not only help raise, but bring more quality to the city and living in it as well. So, thank y'all for coming, appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Lou. So, as you can see, to my right, we have a very special guest, Andi Pitt. She is a founding partner at Ego Death Capital, which is I think it's fair to say, recently founded venture capital firm focused exclusively on Bitcoin, but has nonetheless made, I think, one of the biggest splashes in the industry. So, Andi lives in Austin, is kind enough to come down, make the drive, which is anyone who's done that knows it sucks. So I did that earlier as well. But I think we can start off with Andi. Why don't you just give a little bit of background about yourself, your career, where you came from, maybe how you got into Bitcoin, and tell us about your journey and how you got into Ego Death started.
Can everyone hear me?
Let's see if we can.
We gotta move it a little closer.
Yeah, why don't you just take that and maybe I'll take this. Is this?
We gotta turn it
I don't think it's on yet.
I thought it was on.
There we go.
Okay.
Yes.
That's weird.
That'll work.
I switched on earlier, but clumsy me.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it? What?
That's fine.
Kind of sort of good enough. It's a quiet room.
Okay. My name is Andi. I grew up in Australia, background in maths and economics. I guess I was always passionate about emerging markets, about governance, about understanding the global financial and economic system, and really seeing that something was broken. That said, I ended up working on Wall Street for a long time, so I was with Goldman Sachs right out of university. I first started in the mergers and acquisitions, leverage finance, and then moved across to New York and sat on the trading floor in a team that was very global. So we did a lot of work kind of creating new structures of investments all around the world, a lot in emerging markets, in a whole range of different asset classes, really like identifying where there were gaps in financing and coming up with a creative solution. So I always loved that like problem solving. That really was quite an entrepreneurial team even within the company. But that said, there was a point in time when I was ready to leave, so I left, and that kind of started a whole journey for me around the world. I actually learned to code, started my own company, went on a whole path there, and then it was really a couple of years ago that I started talking to Jeff and Nico, my business partners now, and I had gotten involved in the crypto space in 2018 when I left Goldman, and it was really interesting. I loved the creativity, I loved this idea of disruption, I loved the idea of what a lot of people were building around really kind of identifying problems and these really creative solutions that were really anti-establishment, I guess, which I really resonated with. At the same time, a lot of the things that people were talking about, the use cases, it was a crypto generally, which I sort of fell into, didn't necessarily make a lot of sense to me. And there was a lot of like technology trying to find a problem as opposed to a problem trying to find a solution. And so it was really, I guess, seeing the broader macro thematics through the last few years and speaking to Jeff and Nico and really understanding Bitcoin more broadly. I was like not super early into Bitcoin as a lot of people were. It was really just the last couple of years. And really seeing that it's not just about a decentralized ledger, that it's kind of this technology which has potential impacts in so many different spheres, including governance, including global macroeconomics, including global geopolitics, and particularly around financial inclusion. So we see a lot of use cases for Bitcoin where here, like most people generally have an ability to save somewhat in US dollars, an ability to have a bank account, a credit card, things sort of work okay. But for people in emerging markets, they don't have access to a bank account. Someone in Nigeria, it can take days or weeks if you manage to open a bank account at all, or you're in a country where you have a currency that's being hyperinflated away from you. You don't even have a way to save. You want to send money across border. So it's the use cases in emerging markets are just so obvious, and they're like such huge problems that Bitcoin technology can actually solve. And so that was a lot of the conversation with Nico and I and Jeff around, yes, the use cases in developed countries, but so that's sort of my journey to Bitcoin. And then the reason we created the fund was recognizing that there's a inflection point we're at with the technology. So with the Lightning Network really coming to maturity, it enables a lot of the use cases for Bitcoin. So historically, you couldn't do that much with Bitcoin because of the nature of the development, which is a feature, not a bug. You want it to be slow, stable, solid, this kind of foundation for a new global financial system. And recognizing that with Lightning and a few other technological developments, it actually allows applications to be built onto Bitcoin. And that's what actually makes Bitcoin ultimately valuable, is the applications. And without that ecosystem being vibrant, being strong, being really thriving, Bitcoin will have challenges. And so we saw this need and opportunity to create the venture fund to actually invest in the entrepreneurs who are building those applications, building that technology to actually allow Bitcoin to be usable by everyone around the world. I don't know.
Yeah, fantastic. I think you covered a lot there. Yeah, she's done this before. I think you can tell. Last time I saw you on stage, you're actually in a much bigger crowd at a conference in Los Angeles. So great tonight. So, well, I think one of the things you mentioned is that you came from Goldman Sachs. So, I mean, that's a pretty big jump to go from analyst at Goldman Sachs moving to Austin, Texas to go start a venture fund in Bitcoin. First thing I have to ask is, what did your friends think of you from Goldman?
That's a very good question. Most of my colleagues at Goldman, so most of my close team that I worked with, are no longer at Goldman. There's been a few shakeups since I was there, but most people within that kind of TradFi, at least at Goldman, don't really understand Bitcoin. I think people started to recognize that they need to understand crypto more broadly and then Bitcoin more specifically. I think that inflection point really started obviously with these huge bull runs, the explosion of use cases, DeFi summer, all of those things in the last couple of years have really just put so much of a light on it that they are trying to understand it, but it's like a black box in a way. Like the learning curve for a lot of people to get into, to understand Bitcoin, to understand crypto is so steep. And then there's an element, I think, a psychological element that a lot of people weren't OGs and they consider themselves tech early adopters. They consider themselves people who are ahead of the game. And they weren't necessarily on this one, and they didn't invest it $500, they didn't invest at $3,000, and so now it's like there's this resistance because they didn't get it. It's painful. And so I think there's this emotional resistance to it. And so actually a lot of my people that I very, very much respect at Goldman don't really necessarily support what I'm doing. But that's okay, I'll prove them wrong.
You don't ask a barber if you need a haircut.
Right.
Yeah.
So I gotta ask, since you're looking at all these Bitcoin companies, what is one of the coolest, most intriguing projects you've seen being built on Bitcoin that really catches your attention?
Yeah, so we've invested in 3 companies now. All of them I absolutely love. Bitcoin only, so we only invest in Bitcoin companies. We have had a lot of pitches, and we're very, very selective with the companies we invest in, and we're not just capital, we're really supporting those founders, so it's a smaller number. So those 3 projects I absolutely love, which are Breeze, which is kind of bringing this, it's like an API for anyone to easily deploy, so basically anyone to easily deploy an application onto the Lightning Network and hence use Bitcoin. So they're almost like this enabler for any application developer, any developer to easily write in their code to use Bitcoin. And that's kind of a game changer because historically, you had to learn Bitcoin, you had to learn Lightning, and that was like a really big lift. It's almost like a career change. So that we love. Fedi I love, so I'm not sure if some of you might have heard of Fedi. So the CEO, Obi Nwosu, he's amazing, and they have this vision to bring Bitcoin via a community banking model to underserved populations all around the world. So he's been working with a whole bunch of activists that came out of the Freedom Forum, actually, held by the Human Rights Foundation in Norway last year, where there was this realization that around the world, there are people like freedom fighters, activists around the world trying to create change for their population, and they were fighting on a financial front as well. So the financial system being used as a weapon to keep people down, and realizing that there's also a big tradition in a lot of these countries of community banking models. So they kind of had this lightning bulb moment with Eric Sirian, who had developed this technology, which is effectively, it's kind of similar to like a multi-signature, but it's called a Fedi mint. And realizing that that's this second form of second-party custody. So what we all know is third-party custody, not great. Like, we don't want FTX, we don't want all of these things. First-party custody, it's kind of hard. Like, we learn to do it, it's a learning curve. Hopefully we'll all get there, but honestly, like, it's hard for people. People trust other people more than they trust themselves. And so this Fedi-mint technology is almost like a form of second-party custody. So it's where your friends and family can be the custodians of your Bitcoin, and it's kind of like going back to the old days of Bitcoin of being it's called a Chaumian mint. It's almost like a token within a community, but Lightning enables you to actually connect those tokens. So I could have like a Fedi mint, like a federation for my family. I could have one for my friends. I could have one for my community. If you're like an NGO, they could have one for their community. So they're talking to, Save the Children, for instance, who are really interested in this as a way to provide financial inclusion for their communities. So we love Fedi and the team, and they're also very focused on a go-to-market. That's the term we use in VC, like how they're bringing their technology to the world, which is like really working with people on the ground in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the ex-Soviet countries. And so it's this really like global vision to bring Bitcoin. He has a vision to bring Bitcoin to 1 billion people in like 4 years' time. And it's a big vision, but if anyone can execute on it, it's Obi.
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the biggest arguments I hear for Bitcoin is that it's, on the margin, there's a much bigger difference between Bitcoin and the financial system of sort of third world countries, developing countries. They don't have a lot of people only trust cash because they have absolutely no means of getting recourse on any payments they make. They have no means of confirming people got their payments. And so it ends up devolving into this world where they basically only trust cash and what they can physically see. 2 weeks ago, I was just in Cuba, and so it's sort of raised a lot of these same sort of questions. Where what was interesting is that the state had been battling for years this dichotomy of the fact that they have their state Cuban peso that's mandatory, that everyone accepts, but at the same time you have the dollar, which their largest neighbor that they despise has much better, more sound money than they have, that everyone wants, that they can actually buy things with. So I think it's an interesting dichotomy because you compare to the U.S. This is something I'd like to have your opinion on. In the U.S., we basically have, what Cuba shows is that you can have a secondary money that's not endorsed by the state become the de facto currency. Because after this back and forth, last year they ended up actually just deciding, you know what, screw it, we're just going to allow the dollar. Yeah. So, in my opinion, it seems like maybe that could be something that would happen in the U.S. where I don't know that you'll ever have the U.S. endorse Bitcoin, or at least maybe. I mean, you have certain senators like Lummis and Cruz and things like that. But I'm curious about what your thought is on this, which is to most Americans, we care about the adoption of Bitcoin in America rather than developing countries. Yep. I'm not so certain on how that's going to develop in terms of, how do we have that sort of Cuban moment where a currency that's not endorsed by our own government becomes the de facto currency of the Western world, the world that actually drives the world economy.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously what we all want to see. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen.
Sure.
I think there's so many events that could happen to create shifts towards Bitcoin in the next few years. For instance, if we look at like the debt burden in the US, where that goes, if we look at kind of those sorts of events that maybe could like push forward adoption, I think it's really hard to predict. There's a few things I think there's a lot in the government, a lot of people talking about not wanting to dismiss Bitcoin because it's a technological innovation. And a lot of people in the US, like from the government down, they don't want to put in place a policy that might make America behind on innovation. That's what makes America who it is, the country it is. It's the leader of innovation. It's really where like the brightest minds are. And so from that's what we've seen a lot from people talking in Congress, from senators really saying we don't want to stop Bitcoin because that is effectively a stymieing of innovation, and that's what makes America great. And that's on both sides of the aisle. So I could see a situation where it's like Bitcoin just grows naturally, and it's been really interesting talking to a lot of my friends, a lot of people in my community who are not Bitcoiners per se, and seeing what resonates with them. And so potentially seeing this like groundswell of adoption where you have, and I think that's what really drives it, is adoption of Bitcoin at the population level, as opposed to like a top-down kind of saying, well, you can adopt it, which is what happened in Cuba. Everyone just started using the dollar.
Right.
The government was trying to keep it suppressed, was trying to not allow it because it threatens their power over the financial system. But at the end of the day, when everyone's just using it, the politicians themselves are probably using it, you get to a point where it's like, well, you can't really stop it anymore. And I see that as the path in the US as well.
We need companies to make, we need new companies to exist that actually make it to where it's the better money, the
Yes.
easier to use, the more stable, the safer, the more guaranteed.
And in the meantime, having like, for instance, US dollar stable coins on Bitcoin, it's like that interim period. If you get to a point where there's a Bitcoin standard, it's not going to be in the next 5 years, right, in the US. And so how can you like help allow transactions? You don't want people, their day-to-day spending money to be held in Bitcoin, because that puts them at risk of volatility. So the companies we invest in, for instance, we don't want their treasury to be held in Bitcoin, because that puts their company at risk. Because much as we want things to be on a Bitcoin standard, the reality it isn't. And so having things like a US dollar stable coin where people can have a single wallet, have really easy swaps, so they can hold an amount of money in US dollars and amount of money in Bitcoin, but spend them and transact as though it's the same. That, to me, is an important technological innovation to kind of like bridge that adoption. And then there's just so many use cases we're seeing that are like the companies are building and it's almost like ready, but it's still getting out. So things on transaction costs, on like Sonota, which is working in the energy industry. And so that's one of our companies. And they're basically building a technology for companies to transact physical energy over Lightning, so that the payment flows actually match the flow of physical resources.
So, like, to touch on what you were saying about Bitcoin and being adopted by people, it's essentially doing what money's supposed to do. The people are supposed to choose what they want to use as currency. You know, we've gone from seashells to marbles to rocks, gold, silver, hard metals, and now you're essentially seeing people adopt Bitcoin and use it on their own because it's not ran by no nation state or government. I wanted to ask you, because since you've traveled so much, what do you see that Bitcoin can offer people that maybe we don't see here in America, that we're unaware of? Like, what have you seen? How have you seen it change lives, or how have you seen it impact other people's lives, just from your travels and people you may know?
Yeah. One story stands out, which is kind of terrible, but I don't know whether to share it.
I think now we really need to hear it.
So it's a woman, and there's this terrible industry of people smuggling of North Africa, so particularly amongst Eritreans, and they are being basically kidnapped in Libya and other countries as they're trying to flee. Eritrea has mandatory, it's this tiny little state in the top right of Africa, northeast of Africa, and they have mandatory military. It's just a horrible, horrible dictatorship. And so a lot of people are trying to flee, and there's a woman, obviously, like, that's like money that's going to ransoms, right? It's very controversial. And if these people don't have their ransom paid, they get executed. Like, that's the state of affairs in these countries. And so I'm sorry, it's a bit intense. But then there's a woman who's using Bitcoin to actually pay those ransoms. And she got blocked out of every mainstream financial.
This is for her family members, or?
She kind of runs an NGO now, like supporting these people. And the ransom might be like $70. I mean, it's like, that's the cost of a human life. And so that was some of so my business partner Nico was just at the Bitcoin Africa conference, and they had a lot of people there sharing stories, and that was one of the ones he shared with me that really was like,
There's real demand for things that aren't always endorsed by the Western world.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people are willing to pay it.
And then it's also countries like the Middle East, for instance, where there's a huge amount of oil wealth in places like Saudi, and huge amount of wealth in general, not necessarily from oil, in Dubai.
Mostly.
Well, less so in Dubai now.
Oh, I guess Dubai. Yeah, okay, you got it.
Yeah, but Saudi is full.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how Saudi starts interacting with the global, and that anyway. I think in Texas it's relevant given the energy nexus, but they don't want their financial system to be beholden to American corporations, as it is now, which is Visa and MasterCard. At the moment, it is. That's the way you pay. And so for them, just whether it's the UAE, whether it's Dubai, it's kind of a strange thing if you're the leader of a country and your entire methods of payment and financial system is actually run by an American corporation. So there's a lot of that's another kind of interesting global adoption case.
Yeah, I mean, as Americans, I think we tend to, when you being Australian, I'd be interested to hear your take on this. I mean, Australia's generally aligned with the U.S., but we tend to take it for granted that the most of the world should think like us, when in reality most of it doesn't. Because we have the money of the world and the dollar, we can sort of enforce and police and basically cause other countries to, whether they like it or not, have to do what we want. And I sort of think about, when we think about over the course of history, there have been centuries where one particular currency is dominated. You have the Roman denarius, you move over thousands of years later, you have the British pound, and eventually the dollar comes. So it seems foolish to me that we think the dollar will last forever. And if in the event that it does end, we basically have a choice between maybe the Chinese or maybe a third-party money that no one has to be pushed around by anyone else, like Bitcoin. I think we can probably do one more question, or let's see how we're doing on time here.
It's only until 8. We got a little time.
Until 8, yeah, we can do one more question. I think then we can open up to the audience because we'd love to have the members of our community ask Andy some questions. I'm curious how you think about Bitcoin in this down market, although the last 2 days have been pretty good. But there have been some pretty long crypto winners. I guess this is officially the longest one in terms of with lack of a major bull market. What do you see as the barriers to? I mean, what are the challenges that you expect your companies to face here in the near term? I mean, we sort of have to cross our fingers for a bull market in terms of the success of a lot of these companies, because number go up tends to be the way that these companies capture a lot of revenue, because even events like this are better attended in bull markets. But interest in general in these things, transaction volumes, what do you see as the main challenge of your portfolio companies, in this phase of the market?
I actually think that downturns like this are a really good time to build. It's a time when there isn't the distraction of craziness, of bull runs, of media, of there's so it's like a good time for founding teams to actually put their heads down and actually build technology and build a company. And we really look for companies that actually don't need the Bitcoin price to go up in order for these companies to be successful. So what's like the real world use case that they're solving with Bitcoin, as opposed to in some way being linked to Bitcoin. There's like one company we're investing in.
This actually separates you from a lot of other VCs
Right.
in crypto.
Right, yes.
More generally.
Yeah, so I think that probably does, yeah, I won't say too much, but.
Interject that one there. Who knows what I'm talking about? Okay.
That said, we know that when there is a bull run, of course, that is going to just bring a huge amount of attention to the market. But it's hard to build in those time periods when if your volumes are going through the roof and there's like everything's breaking. And in bull runs as well, you have a lot more capital coming in. So the biggest challenge for companies that want to build something now is capital access. So venture funds have reduced, well, companies, I mean, there's like less people, venture funds are stricter on valuations, there's a lot more thought, there's less capital in general available, and then like less capital coming into funds that are funding them, or less angel checks or whatever, and bigger further on. So you might invest in a company now and they have an 18-month runway, so if the bear market lasts for another 2 years, are they going to be able to raise in that environment? So that's kind of the things that we're thinking about. So I would say getting capital is the biggest problem, and I would say given the nature of the bear market in the collapse of FTX, in that, for instance, that not necessarily the bear market, but those types of events can make it more difficult to talk to someone who doesn't understand Bitcoin and crypto. So if you're trying to get someone to use a technology that maybe is based on Bitcoin, Bitcoin might at the moment have somewhat negative connotations in people's minds because of the crypto more broadly thing that's happening, even though actually Bitcoin doesn't have anything to do with FTX. So that's, I think, one of the challenges of the current bear market is just the sort of negative ramifications in people's minds of like, what the fuck kind of things. So.
It's a lot of noise out there. That's why you got to be able to, attach yourself to signal. Like, you're able to hear the signal through the noise, and you'll be able to, I wouldn't say dodge everything, but you'll be better prepared for like things like an FTX, things like Celsius. Yeah. To touch on what you were saying earlier too about being a bear market and building in it, there's a good saying, it says builders build in bear markets, because essentially if you can survive in a bear market, then you'll thrive when it's a bull market. I want to ask you too, what would your advice be to someone who's thinking of getting into Bitcoin in general? Like any challenges you see you faced, or what would you tell someone that's kind of teeter-tottering on that edge of like, should I go jump in, should I not? Given you came from Finance 1.0, now you're in Finance 2.0, like what would you say to somebody that's kind of thinking about taking the plunge themselves?
I actually think it's quite individual. So I think it's less saying this is what I say and more like what's going to resonate with someone. So what might resonate with one person is different to what might resonate on another person because of their own life experience, their own challenges. So what really resonated with a close friend of mine, she's a doctor, and she calculated that 1 day a month she works just to pay her transaction costs, which is kind of crazy. She's based in Austin. And so that's sort of the thing that really resonated, because she had, before we'd even talked about Bitcoin, like this was something she was very aware of, and she calculated that it's like a day a month that she works extra just because of transaction costs.
100% fee, right?
Right. And so when I sort of spoke about the potential that there's using the Lightning Network, that potentially, you could have systems of transactions which have lower transaction costs, that's the message that really resonated with her. Someone who has a passion or has traveled in emerging markets, maybe that's what resonates. Or someone who maybe has been a bit frustrated with the level of government control in the last few years, maybe that's what resonates. For my mom, for instance, and I shouldn't talk about her so publicly, what resonates is like the control of her own money, because she had a banking scam, like a phone scam happened to her. And it was like, it shouldn't have happened if she was holding her own keys and she knew to do that. And so she feels like she can't trust the banks anymore. And so she feels like she doesn't have sovereignty over her money because that thing was kind of out of her control. And so then that's kind of the message that really resonated with her around Bitcoin. And so it's just, I mean, yeah, so I sort of try and understand the people I'm talking to, and maybe it resonates, and maybe for some people it doesn't at this point. Maybe it'll take time.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's may the best money win, and we've got a lot of reason to believe it's Bitcoin.